I'm feeling good. I'm feeling good. Dr. Mandela's here. We're trying to organize this activity for, for kids to have an enriched, educational experience. So him being here is great. We're expecting to hear a lot about Dr. Mandela's experience. I mean, certainly his family life with Nelson Mandela. He's the great grandson. About what's happening presently in Africa, I think is the thing that we're really looking forward to understanding, because everybody has so many images and myths and misconceptions about Africa, and it'll be very interesting for him to, be able to sort of set the record straight, let children, let the students know that there are all kinds of opportunities, things going on, all kinds of development in Africa, despite what they may hear on the news. How are you?
Hi, good.
Yes.
Thank you for this.
You're quite welcome. You're quite welcome.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So,
Hi.
This is Mr. Paul Green. This is Sabrina Giffrelli.
Yes.
She does work here on DEI and unconscious bias and stuff for the school board. I think he's also going to talk about the importance of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, which are part of the network that I'm involved with, the Canadian Black Educators National Network. We're about that diversity, about inclusion and equity. We want to enhance the educational experience of black students in particular, but all students. But we want to be able to give people an opportunity to be able to, dream a little bit, to figure out that, hey, maybe I can be that. In the black community, we have a saying, if I can see it, I can be it. The problem is we haven't seen it very often, I went to school without ever having a black teacher or a black principal or vice principal or anything. Nobody of importance in the institutions that I attended. Went right through college and university as well. So although I did have some black teachers and professors and scattered throughout my post-secondary education. So what we want to do is we want to give the young people an idea that, hey, maybe I can be that too. This is how stadiums and auditoriums work. Maybe I can do and achieve and go beyond what maybe society has in terms of expectations for me of just being, a black person who, will not achieve very much. As a matter of fact, when I was graduating high school, my principal told me, shouldn't go to college, go for trades because nobody's ever going to hire you. That's the kind of legacy I bring to this, and it's not the kind of legacy I wanted for my children or for, kids who, in the future. So that's why we're here, and really I'm looking forward to the day.
And now my name is Dr. Siyabulela Mandela. I am a descendant of King Ngubengcuka from the Tembu Kingdom. The Tembu Kingdom is configured of 5 houses. I come from the last house of the Tembu Kingdom, and that is the house of Mandela. The kingdom is geographically located in the southern tip of the African continent, in the eastern part of that continent, in a country called South Africa. I come from a province called Eastern Cape. And the language that I speak, my mother tongue, that is Xhosa. It uses a lot of clicks. I stand before you today, standing in the shoulders of my ancestors, Madiba, Sopicho, Yemyem, Ngolomsila, Zonda Zinjaba, Nobazgamzonda, Ngeke Zmenzenda. Those are the names of the great heroes and heroines who have came before me, who have led my kingdom through difficult times, through hard times, and through glorious moments in our history. It is of critical importance for me in particular to introduce myself and locate myself in my own genealogy. When I say to you, I stand in their shoulders, I see them in spirit among you. I hope that today they embrace me with a blanket of wisdom, that I'll share some of the few words with all of you. So with all those words, all protocol, observed. And I think it is also important for me to stress the importance of knowing your history. I come from a history where my people have been marginalized, oppressed, suppressed, and stripped of their dignity and identity. So in moments like these, it is a moment where I reclaim who I am, reclaim my identity. I come from an ancestry that emerges from kingdoms, those that oppressed us. The United Kingdom, they treated us as slaves. My forefathers, foremothers, they were considered to be slaves. They fought relentlessly against such injustices of colonialism and apartheid, so that my generation do not have to experience the injustices that they went through. It is of critical importance, therefore, that I engage with you from that framework so that you understand who we are, you understand our history, so that if among you there are those who still not yet know who they are, they take an initiative to find out where they come from, who they are. And I believe as I engage with you, there are those who have experienced the same injustices, the indigenous communities in these lands, to whom we have for the longest of time aligned ourselves with them. And we saw ourselves through their eyes, for we have shared experiences. But that's not the only thing that I want to engage you with today. Today, we are here to reflect on the legacy of the great giant of history, our former president and our nation's father, Dr. Nelson Mandela. Today, I hope that from his legacy, there are lessons for us to draw as this generation. Today, I hope that from his legacy, we are able to draw lessons, devise strategies and tactics to confront the problems that affects our generation. And where do I begin, therefore? Telling the story of this great giant of history. Mandela was born in a village called Unu, where I come from. And he was born from the house of Mandela. Our responsibility as the house of Mandela within the broader kingdom of the Tembu people was to maintain law, peace, and order within the kingdom. Whenever the 4 other houses in the Tembu kingdom are in conflict with one another over succession, over power, our role as the house of Mandela was to maintain peace and order in that kingdom. When he was born, he was given a name by his father, who perhaps had a foresight, maybe given to him the wisdom from the past generation, that he will give birth to a son who would later cause havoc. His name was called Rolihlahla, which means in our language, or if you translate it in English, the troublemaker. Perhaps his father knew what was to come and what was to befall his people. His father would be later be banished and expelled from his land because he refused to cooperate and collaborate with the colonial regime. And of course, he sent his son to one of the chiefdoms within the kingdom to raise him. And him being born as a troublemaker, he was friends with the son of the chief, the prince at that time. And as they were growing up, and as expected in our culture, they were expected to get married when they come of age. So the chief of the village and the father of the prince, to whom Mandela was his friend, decided that he was going to pick wives for both Mandela and the prince. And it so happened that they both were dating two different women. But to the younger generation, the relationship part of it is not really where I'm going to. But it so happened that the chief decided to pick a girlfriend for the prince and Mandela, and they mishmashed the girlfriends. He picked for Mandela a girlfriend of the chief, of the prince, and he picks for the prince a girlfriend of Mandela. So growing up as two brothers, they decided that there's no way they could settle this. So they decided that they would steal a cow from the chief's kraal, and they sold this cow, and they went thousands of kilometers to another city, where they decided that instead of betraying their friendship and relationship, they would rather run away. So they ran away, stole a cow, sold the cow, took the money, and they went to Johannesburg, which was more like stealing a cow from your father's kraal in Toronto, and you move all the way up to New Brunswick to live a different lifestyle. So that's what they did. And when they got to Johannesburg, Mandela worked in the mines as a security guard. And of course, knowing the world, that the world is very small, someone identified the prince and Mandela and called the chief and said, "Your son and your nephew, they are here." And of course, the prince, because he had a responsibility to assume the crown as the next chief, he had to go back home. For Mandela, he had nothing much to lose, for the apartheid regime had stolen his father's land. His family was banished from their own land. So all he had was to remain in Johannesburg, work as a security guard in a mine. From there, he met what would later become his wife, Winnie Mandela, one of the most fierce women I've ever met in my life. Winnie introduced Mandela into politics. This is very critical. It's important because we live in a very patriarchal society where oftentimes when the story of great men is told, a woman is always left behind. But it was Winnie who introduced Mandela into politics. It was Winnie who introduced Mandela to his mentor, Oliver Tambo. And Mandela would later on join politics in South Africa. And at the time when Mandela was growing up, there was already a movement against colonialism and against oppression. In North America, there was a massive movement called the Civil Rights Movements. And that was directed towards against the injustices of discrimination and segregation here in North America. And of course, you'd remember that it was led by the great leaders such as Martin Luther King.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
Malcolm X and many others, Rosa Parks and many others, who played a key role in advancing a struggle against the different forms of injustices, discrimination. In South Africa, Mandela joined a movement which was directed against the injustices of apartheid. Apartheid was a system. For those of you who perhaps do not understand and know it, apartheid was in fact forged at the backdrop of 1876 Indian Act here in Canada. The apartheid regime, when they instituted the segregation system in South Africa, they came to Canada to study the Indian Act and how the indigenous communities were marginalized, stripped of their identity, their culture. You'd remember one of the key slogans of the Indian Act was to getting rid of the Indian from the Indian child. That was what apartheid was in South Africa. Of course, also informed by the frameworks of the Jim Crow laws of the South in the United States. So when the apartheid regime and their leaders came to Canada, they came to study that oppressive system, how it was applied, how it was deployed. And they took that system back to South Africa. In 1948, we saw an emergence of the most violent, pernicious system, more violent than the colonial system in South Africa. It was called apartheid, forged on segregation. It was this system that Mandela, as they were growing up, Mandela and his generation, sought to oppose, protest, and resist. It was at this period where the liberation movement, or the fight against the injustices of apartheid, were mostly informed by the civil rights movement through the nonviolent movement from the United States, informed by the likes of Martin Luther King and, of course, Mahatma Gandhi. But when apartheid was instituted at the backdrop of the Indian Act here in Canada, we saw a shift, introducing a system that was more violent, more pernicious, which resulted into segregation, land dispossession, and different forms of violence and the injustices that defined the realities of my people. When Mandela was contemplating on the different strategies and tactics that they should apply as they were advancing a struggle against apartheid, they found themselves in a difficult position where they were dealing with a movement and a generation that pursued a different strategy and an approach against segregation, against discrimination, and against injustice. In the West, it was a civil rights movement, which used the nonviolent movement led by Martin Luther King, informed by Mahatma Gandhi. I hope some of you have studied that in your history lessons. Mandela came through that movement, but in 1948, when a more violent system was introduced, he realized that it was no longer feasible for him and his generation, and this is Mandela was in his late 30s, early 40s. They decided that it was no longer feasible for them to follow the approaches by the previous generation of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi of nonviolence. So Mandela decided that he would come across with what he defined as the Mandela Plan. He engaged the liberation movement he was coming for, the African National Congress, to say perhaps we need to change our strategy of resistance. Maybe we should adopt violence as a means to force the oppressive regime to come into the negotiation table. They refused. But they said to him, if you want to continue with that plan, that is for you and your generation. But as this generation, if you guys get caught, we'll reject you. They rejected them. That was a breakaway from Mandela's generation with the previous generation. And I suppose he was more influenced by the leaders within the civil rights movement, such as Malcolm X, as opposed to Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi. And Mandela pursued a more violent approach into the liberation movement. There, Mandela emerged as a leader of the younger generation, very militant. He established what became known as Umkhonto weSizwe, the spear of the nation. And he would sneak out of the country in the early 1950s, where he traveled across the African continent mobilizing support for an armed resistance. And there he enabled an opportunity for an establishment of a small army of young people that were ready to resist using arms and that were ready to sacrifice themselves in pursuit of justice, in pursuit of peace, and in pursuit of freedom. And of course, the consequences of such was Mandela being arrested. We remember him in 1963 before he was sentenced into life imprisonment. He was called to make his address into the court. It is within this context where Mandela stated it clearly what was the mission and the vision of his own generation. He articulated clearly that what they were fighting for was justice. What they were fighting for was peace. What they were fighting for was liberation of the oppressed people in South Africa. And that they were ready, and these were his last statements, that he was ready to die if needs be. And of course, his lawyer, George Bezos, who was a Jewish lawyer, the only lawyer that was willing to represent Mandela. And it is critical for me to state this because there's a lot of geopolitics and a lot of problems that are happening in the world today. And a lot of information get mixed up. At the time when we're fighting against the apartheid regime, the forces that joined Mandela were the Jewish community. And both the Jews and Mandela were all arrested in prison. And as such, the lawyer that represented him was a Jewish lawyer. White people could not represent him because they did not believe in the ideals of justice, peace, and freedom. And of course, Mandela was spent 27 years into prison. I'm trying to move quickly so that I can get into the point that I'm driving to. When Mandela came out, he engaged, when the apartheid regime realized that it is impossible for them to kill the dream of peace, the dream of liberty, the dream of freedom. For when Mandela was arrested, a new generation emerged, informed by the ideals that Mandela fought for. And when that generation was arrested, another generation emerged, which was more militant and ready to die for peace, justice, freedom, and liberty for all. And the apartheid regime realized that in the late 1980s, they should negotiate with the resistance movement. They should engage with Mandela, try to understand him. After locking him up for 27 years, they realized that perhaps he was right. Perhaps all this long, him and his generation were right about this idea of liberty, this idea of freedom and justice and equality for all. What is critical here, and most importantly, is that when Mandela was released in prison 11 February 1990, he played one of the key and central roles in bringing the country together. Today, South Africa is known as a rainbow nation, a country that celebrates diversity, a country that is founded on the foundation of human rights, universal human rights for all, a country that is characterized by democracy, justice, freedom, and peace for all. And these were the words that Mandela said in his first speech when he came out of prison. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be water, land, and bread for all. And these were the affirmation of the vision and the mission that Mandela had alongside with this generation, what they wanted to achieve. And one of the things that we need to highlight and note here is the importance of what Mandela was fighting for and the role that the younger generation played in fighting for the limited freedoms that we are enjoying today. And here I invoke one of the greatest scholars of philosophy and decolonial scholarship as you're about to enter into university. These are some of the names you'll hear of. That is Frantz Fanon, who argues that each generation must discover its own purpose and mission, fulfill it, or betray it with relative authenticity. Here, Fanon identifies the importance of the mission for each and every generation. And what we learn from Mandela's legacy and what he fought for, it is clear for us what was their vision, what was their mission as a generation. And his legacy calls upon us as this generation to discover what is our mission and what is our vision. Today, as this generation, just like the generation of Mandela, we are confronted by the realities of war. Today, just like Mandela's generation, we are confronted by the realities of discrimination, racism. We see leaders who want and yearn for the good old days of segregation. Your neighbors are regressing on the policies of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Mandela fought for diversity. He realized and he imagined a world where a man would be treated equally, regardless of the color of their skin, their creed, their religion. He imagined a world where we will sit as all members of the human family, break bread, concern ourselves about building bridges, standing shoulders to shoulders with our neighbors, not defined by race, not defined by color, not defined by creed. But today, we see once again a re-emergence of the policies that seeks to divide us. The leaders that we elect into power, case in point in the United States today, whatever political side you align yourself with, the liberals and the Democrats, they use race, they use color as the tool to divide us as the people. And Mandela and his generation, they fought against that. They fought for a world where we could stand together in unity. I think in 1963, Martin Luther King, in his speech, "I Have a Dream," his dream was a world defined by diversity, a world defined by humanity, more than anything that distinguishes. Today, we live in a world that constantly focuses more on the things that divide us, the things that makes us different with one another. Perhaps this generation that is administering us as this younger generation, perhaps they've forgotten what the previous generation fought for. Perhaps this is a moment in history for us as this generation to decide whether do we still want to be defined through the lenses of race, through the lenses of color, or do we want to hold hands with our friends, brothers, standing side by side, rejecting the notion of race that is used by our leaders to divide us. Perhaps we want a different reality. It is up to us as this generation. And there's something that we can do about it. And that begins with us standing up for our brothers, for our friends. When those who don't look like us are being told to go back where they come from, it is our responsibility to say, these are my friends, these are my brothers. It is our responsibility as this generation to stand up against discrimination. It is our responsibility to build upon the foundation laid by our forefathers, foremothers, our forebears. They've made a sacrifice in fighting for the limited freedoms that we're enjoying today. If we see ourselves being betrayed by the current generation that is in position of power, it is our moment as this generation to resist, to fight, and to protect the fundamental principles that we all subscribe to, and that is the principles of diversity, the principles of freedom, the principles of justice. It is incumbent upon us as this generation to identify once again what is our mission and what is our vision. But most importantly, and this is Mandela who identifies it very well, but before that, I would like to also invoke Horace Mann, 1838. He argues, education then, beyond all other devices of human origin, it is the greatest equalizer of the condition of man. if we are to fight for justice, freedom, equality within our society, we have to anchor that within education. And Mandela would later broadly put forward the importance and the role of education, that education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change the world. In other words, as this younger generation, we must draw our wisdom. We must make it part of our culture to be in pursuit of knowledge. For the greatest weapon at the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. If we liberate ourselves through knowledge and pursuit of education, we'll be at our disposal, possessing the greatest weapon we can use to change the world. Yesterday might be bleak. It might be characterized by a lot of violence, war, and injustice, as today is. But tomorrow is in our hands to determine what kind of a future we want for ourselves and generations yet to come. And that is our role as this generation. If we anchor it in pursuit of knowledge, as Mandela had argued, I remembered Mandela, it took him 24 years to finish his degree. He studied while he was in prison. He graduated while he was in prison with his law degree. It took him 24 years. Imagine what we can do as this generation. We are not in prison. We have an opportunity, a golden opportunity in our hands to shape the kind of a future that we want. The future that is not defined by discrimination. The future that is not defined by racism. A future where we are not defined through the lenses of race, color, and creed. A future where we are defined by diversity. And it is, as Mandela says, it is now in our hands to determine what kind of a future we want. But I'll conclude by invoking Mandela once again. Elsewhere he argues, what counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived, but what difference we have made in the lives of others that will determine the kind of a life that you lead. And I conclude here by saying, be the difference, be the change that you want to see in society. And I thank you.
I think what was important about bringing Dr. Mandela here is because he is somebody who is acting on an international stage. He gets to represent his family name and his country, South Africa. He's involved in peace resolution and conflict resolution around the world. And I thought it was important to see for young people to see somebody who not only has a history and a legacy, but is doing things today, all right, to continue his great-grandfather's message, all right, and bring people together. I think young people today need to be able to see that they have a tremendous opportunity here with the kind of diversity that they have in the classroom, both in terms of students and in terms of their teachers, which is experience I never had, that they can, all right, reach out and, and work together and realize that they are, as part of Dr. Mandela's message was, to be human beings, that we're all human beings. And the moment that we can realize that, and we can act together, we can do very powerful things to improve the lot of all human beings on this earth.
Parfait, excellent. Merci beaucoup.